In this lesson, we'll be talking about another one of the common issues you'll encounter in sentence correction problems on the executive assessment, verb tenses. Now, before we go into verb tenses specifically, let's just talk about the question logistics for sentence corrections on the EA. First, remember that there are going to be assumed 3 to 5 sentence corrections in each 14-question verbal section. You're going to have 1 to 3 sentence corrections in each 7-question half, and these do have the least to read for any verbal section question format. As far as our strategic best practices go for this question form, remember that you're going to spend about 90 seconds as an average per question. You're going to have a maximum of 2 minutes. That's pretty hard as a cap for any of these questions because they should be adjudicated relatively quickly, whether you are definitively certain of the answer or not. You'll want to limit yourself to a single reread before eliminating and guessing to save time, and that single reread ideally should come at the very end of the process as the last step to confirm that your correct answer does capture the intended meaning of the original sentence. Be careful of just listening for errors. Unfortunately, the English ear for grammar is not great for most people, and instead you want to visually look for differences indicating possible common sentence correction issues, such as verb tense errors. So, to find verb tense errors, first just clinically evaluate the logical chronology in the sentences written using the non-underlined information that you know has to be correct. You'll also want to note the changes in the ending of verbs in the original sentence and in the choices, because if it switches from like an ED to an ES, that might be indicating a possible verb tense issue. And recognize the difference in certain and conditional statements in terms of meaning, because that too is something that very subtly can change the meaning of the sentence materially. And if you catch it, it may make the sentence correction go a lot more quickly. So, strategically for verb tense errors, you want to beware of just auto matching all verbs to a single tense. The exam knows that test takers really like to do this, so you have to guard against that kind of simple mistake. Because you have to note that the rules of English allow for multiple tenses within a single sentence. So, for instance, I could say, I went to the store before I decided to go to the gym and plan on doing so after I do my homework or something of that nature. There's a bunch of different tenses in that sentence, but it's allowed because of the flexibility of the English language. You do, however, have to confirm that all items in lists or comparisons use a consistent tense. So I can't say I went for a run, I ate my breakfast, and later that day decided to go to the dry cleaner. Like that's not necessarily all parallel. I need to make sure that everything is parallel in terms of tenses if I'm dealing with a specific list or a direct comparison. You do, of course, want to read your choice back into the original sentences written to confirm a logically ordered predication, just that everything logically is ordered in terms of the events as presented. And one thing that I always mention is avoid trying to define the tenses in real time. It's completely unnecessary. We're going to spend the next couple of slides talking about the difference between simple tenses, perfect tenses, conditional tenses, but it's going to be focused more on meaning and recognition of errors as opposed to trying to fix the sentence using your own preferred tense. One of the things you really have to avoid here is trying to predict a fix, because very frequently the correct answer is not one that you would have used as the proper verb tenses. So let's take a look at simple tenses. So when should simple verb tenses be used? First, we know that simple past is just when a single action started and finished. Simple present is going to be an abstract current action or a scheduled action. And what that means is that it's something that is presently abstractly occurring, but not necessarily at this very moment. And future simple future tense is going to be an action that is just going to occur later, but not necessarily at a defined time. So let's look at some examples of past tense, starting with Carlo was content. Simple enough, it's just what Carlo was. David planned to go. Again, simple past tense often uses ed formations. Again, not guaranteed because English has a lot of exceptions, but the exam, again, doesn't necessarily test irregular verbs all that frequently. And if it does, that often can be kind of a red herring to get you to focus on something that may be a little bit more abstract and obscure. And then the team congratulated Gregor. Simple enough. Passed, done, finished. They congratulated Gregor. Or it congratulated Gregor. Present tense, Carlo is content. Carlo is right now content. That is what he is. That is fine. David plans to go. Again, maybe isn't thinking about it at this very moment, but abstractly in the present, David plans to go. And the team congratulates Gregor is the kind of phrasing that often students will go, ew, that doesn't sound great. And honestly, you're probably not going to see the team or going to hear the team congratulates Gregor in conversation. However, imagine it as a press release or something of that nature. The team congratulates Gregor for many years of service. You go, yeah, that's how it would sound. And that's because abstractly, right now, the team congratulates Gregor. So that's why we want to look at some of these tenses and consider them in that fashion as opposed to just listening to how it sounds in our heads, because the team congratulates Gregor is probably not something that sounds all that great to you when you think about it that way. Now, our simple future tense, Carlo will be content, again, at some undefined point in the future. David will plan to go, again, at some undefined point in the future. And the team will congratulate Gregor, again, at some point undefined in the future. So now that we've talked about simple tenses, let's talk about perfect tenses. Again, big picture, don't need to focus on all of the nuances and details. We just need to get enough for this particular test. So some tips for using the perfect tense. Generally, perfect tenses are going to be used in the past when multiple completed actions have occurred and they require proper ordering. The present perfect is going to be necessary most likely when you've got an action that began in the past but finishes in the present, or is continuing into the present. And then a future perfect tense is going to be when you have an action that is going to be completed at a defined time in the future, so it's not indefinite any longer. So our past perfect tense, Carlo had been content. Simple enough. Then something else happened, and probably Carlo was no longer content. David had planned to go, again, until some other action occurred that probably stopped him from planning to go. And the team had congratulated Gregor until something else happened. Perhaps Gregor blew the next game. Our present perfect tense, very similar in structure to past perfect, and again, kind of is dependent on what the surrounding context would be. But Carlo has been content up until this point in the past and now, probably. David has planned to go in the past until now and maybe into the future, but we need surrounding context. And the team has congratulated Gregor again in the past and probably is continuing to do so into the present, potentially stopping, but we don't know without that additional context. Future perfect tense is going to require the context at all points. So Carlo will have been content for days at some point. And you're like, okay, will have been content for days when that happened, whatever the thing is. David will have planned to go by September. We know when he will have planned. It's in September or by September. And lastly, the team will have congratulated Gregor for the win when that occurs. So there's your circumstance. So now let's talk about conditionals and how conditional verb tenses are used. So the main thing with conditionals is you've got to recognize that it is necessary. And that usually is because there's a dependent if clause or whether clause that dictates that something is going to occur. In the past, if you're using conditionals, you're going to require some sort of perfect phrasing. It really is dependent on just the individual verb, but you're going to use something that looks similar to what we saw on the previous slides. In our future conditionals, you just have to be careful of confusing possibilities with certainties, because you can't say, if this were to occur, I will do it. It's actually, I would do it, because the would says that it's dependent on said conditional. So let's take a look at a couple of examples and see how this all comes together, starting with just tracking timing. So as always, reread the sentence as it's written to start. Oxygen profiles of diving emperor penguins illustrate that arterial hemoglobin saturation is maintained near 100% throughout most of a dive, declining only in the final portion of the dive as the birds ascend and ambient pressure declines. So we need to identify the main subject-verb pair in the original sentence as written, and we see oxygen profiles illustrate. And we consider what tense that is. And it's just our simple present tense. Oxygen profiles illustrate. And that's all fine. And we know that it would have to be fine because it's not underlined. But That makes sense. They can illustrate abstractly right now. That's no problem there. Then we need to track tenses of any additional subject verb pairs, and we find another immediately following that. Arterial hemoglobin saturation is maintained. Same simple present tense is for the arterial hemoglobin saturation, and maintained is not functioning as a verb here. It is the thing that is being done. So the maintained is the part we really got to focus on and be careful with as we introduce our answer choices. So we talked about this at the start. You do want to consider if changes in tense are logically mandated by sentence chronology. And in this case, we'd say not really. We saw a bunch of present tenses. It's fine. And we need to be aware of that auto matching tenses in the answer choices and just using that as a quote unquote shortcut. Because is maintaining and declining, that doesn't make sense. If we read arterial hemoglobin saturation is maintaining, that means at this very moment right now. And that is not what this is trying to say, saying abstractly in the present. So we can eliminate B even though it matches those two verbs if you were just to kind of glance at it. Same thing is going to apply for choice D because we don't need to change that declining at the end to a declined. We don't want to say maintained declined because if we look at the non-underlined verbs, we find after that declining is the birds ascend. So we need to keep it in the present tense. So we are then going to be able to eliminate choices C and E for introducing incorrect past tenses of declined and having been maintained. And we just want to read our original sentence once more to confirm that it captured a logical meaning at the outset. Oxygen profiles of diving emperor penguins illustrate that arterial hemoglobin saturation is maintained near 100% throughout most of a dive, declining only in the final portion of the dive as the birds ascend and ambient pressure declines. Seems to make sense to me, and we'd happily select choice A. So now let's go take a look at an example that involves conditionals. So, as always, read the sentence as originally presented. One will expect if these stamps did originate from the trial sheet, the impression to be pristine and the plate numbers on all stamps to look identical in shape and position. So, as always, we want to proactively evaluate that main subject verb pair. And in this case, we're going to include in the evaluation that object that one will expect. So, we just simplify it. One will expect the impression, and everything that comes afterwards in the non-underlined can kind of be ignored, at least for this specific evaluation. Then we want to determine if that action, that one will expect the impression to be something, is definitive or conditional based on surrounding context. And you can use whether and if as indicators of possible conditionality. And we see that there's a clear if clause between our subject and our object here. So if these stamps did originate, one will expect the impression to be multiple things. So now let's introduce our answer choices and consider the implications of that conditional. Because stating that something will occur, that's not going to be the proper use of a conditional verb. We know that if something were to happen, another thing would then happen. So that allows us to identify the wills in choices A, B, and D as definitively incorrect, and we just focused on this one issue rather than working through the sentence multiple times for different differences we found. Then we have to consider the remaining answer choices. Again, we can stick to this categorical issue of verb tense and make sure that they are logically ordered with the correct tenses that best match the original intent of the sentence. And in choices C and E, we could see differences between would and could. And as it were written, it's clear from the intent that if the stamps did originate, then the will expect clause is certain. So changing the verb to could means it's possible. And the intent was that it was certain provided the condition would be met. So we can eliminate choice E for changing the meaning with a change in tense. And of course, we read the sentence back into the original using our choice to make sure that the intent is what was originally stated in the first option. If these stamps did originate from the trial sheet, then one would expect the impression to be pristine and the plate numbers on all stamps to look identical in shape and position. And yes, that captures the original intent of the sentence as it was written. and introduces no errors while fixing the will-would error that we started our evaluation with, and we can happily select C at that point. So now let's just consider our verb tense evaluation checklist. First, focus on identifying the main subject verb pair of the sentence and confirm that it has the proper tense based on surrounding chronology and context, whether that's simple, perfect, conditional. Then, step two, you want to use the non-underlined portion to confirm that all underlined verbs in the sentence use proper tenses based on the surrounding context. And if the main actions are definitive, meaning there are no conditional clauses, then you can use the simple or perfect tenses to properly order the actions throughout the sentence. But if there was a conditional, or if there were a conditional, confirm the proper conditional usage and beware of subtly changing possible acts to certain ones by using an incorrect tense. That was that issue of will versus would. And then, of course, read your selection back into the sentence to ensure it captures the intended meaning of the original and does so using proper chronology. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and take a look at a couple more examples before having you practice your own verb tense drills as you get ready for the executive assessment. So, setting up our scratch pad as we always do, we got A, B, C, D, E, put a little line over top, and we begin by reading the sentence as written. With archaeology discussed and practiced across the country in museums and institutions, finally, in 1961, the Brazilian federal government enacted a law for the protection of archaeological sites and monuments. So, we first start with our main verb and subjects. So we've got with archaeology discussed and practiced. And then we have the Brazilian federal government enacted a law. And there's a time indicator here of finally. So that tells us that we need to be really careful with our verb tenses here. So we're just going to label this up as verb tenses. And we can see that when we look at our answer choices, we've got changes and we have enacted, having enacted, and enacted in the ends. And we've got discussed, having been discussed, and being discussed at the beginning. So we need to consider whether it should be discussed, having been discussed, or being discussed. And it's probably easiest to eliminate the being discussed at this point because we know that this is not the year 1961. So that'll allow us to eliminate choice E. Then we have to decide whether it needs to be discussed or having been discussed. And if we've got discussed and having been practiced, well, the discussed and practiced in the original are concurrent. So that means that choice D, that's not going to be correct, and we can eliminate that. Then we have to determine whether it's going to be discussed and practiced or having been discussed and practiced. And we know that if it's going to be discussed and practiced and we put having enacted, well, the having enacted would have happened first. And it says that the discussed and practiced occurred first. So that allows us to eliminate B. So then it really comes down to whether we need the having been discussed and practiced versus just discussed and practiced. And the discussed and practiced led to the final ultimate action of, in 1961, the Brazilian government enacting that law. So we need the proper order. So that means that choice A goes away because we want the discussed and practiced to have occurred and led to the government enacting. So let's read choice C just to make sure that everything aligns chronologically. With archaeology having been discussed and practiced across the country in museums and institutions. Finally, in 1961, the Brazilian federal government enacted a law for the protection of archaeological sites and monuments. Well, that gets the proper chronology and makes it clear that the discussing and practicing in the museums and institutions ultimately was what led to the Brazilian federal government enacting those laws in 1961. So let's go ahead and scroll down and take a look at one more example here to see different implications of verb tense. So once more, setting up our scratch pad, we got A, B, C, D, E here, put a little line over top, and we start by reading the sentence as written. While effective for small, hard-bodied forms like copepods, Constraining animals with tethers and other devices to restrict their movements is usually impractical for larger gelatinous animals and can create problems with natural fluid flow. So, we once more have some relatively strangely sounding uh, answer choices and an original sentence as well. So, we don't really care about everything that's not underlined. So once again, we can potentially kind of simplify things. So I don't really care that it is effective for small hard-bodied forms, including copepods. We know, however, that our main subject is constraining animals with tethers and other devices. So constraining animals, we don't really, again, care that it's with tethers and other devices. To restrict their movements is, well, constraining animals is usually impractical. That's fine. That's present tense for larger gelatinous animals and can create, again, a possibility, but present tense in its nature, problems with natural fluid flow. So we'll focus on verb tense here. But I personally don't see an issue if we simplify things down to what really is going to affect our underlying portion. Now, if instead we go from a can create to just creates or creating, we've changed what is a possibility into a certainty. And B, C, and E each incorrectly change the meaning by making what was once a possibility into a certainty. So we can eliminate each of those answer choices for this single issue. Then we've got to look at what's changing between A and D. And it's relatively subtle, but we're moving this usually. So is usually impractical for larger gelatinous animals makes it so that constraining the animals to restrict their movements is usually impractical. Whereas if we said constraining animals to restrict their movements is impractical for usually larger gelatinous animals and can create, again, it's strange with that can create, but we know that D also changes that meaning because it's saying that it is definitively impractical as opposed to being usually impractical. So we'll reread choice A, once again, bringing in all of that information that we were basically overlooking to simplify our evaluations. And we say, while effective for small, hard-bodied forms like copepods, constraining animals with tethers and other devices to restrict their movements is usually impractical for larger gelatinous animals and can create problems with natural fluid flow. That is a clear meaning with the proper conditional without changing it to a certainty, and that would be our correct answer as written. So go ahead and attempt some verb tense questions on your own to get better at this aspect of the verbal section.